The folder hit the kitchen table hard enough to rattle the coffee mugs. Lena Hartwell, 37-year-old director of the Hartwell Community Trust and wife of Preston Hartwell, did not flinch. She had learned a long time ago not to flinch. Preston Hartwell, 43-year-old chief operating officer of Crestfield Capital Group, stood at the other end of the table with his jaw set and his eyes already somewhere else. Somewhere she couldn't follow him anymore. "You went through my office," he said. "It wasn't a question." "I was looking for the insurance forms," Lena said. "The ones you said you filed in March. You should have asked me." "I did ask you 3 times. He didn't answer that. He never answered the things he couldn't argue with. He just picked up his keys from the counter, told her not to wait up, and walked out the front door of the house she had lived in for 11 years. The house that still had her grandmother's curtains in the dining room and the growth chart penciled on the pantry doorframe from when her niece and nephew used to visit. The house that had stopped feeling like home somewhere around the time she stopped being able to say exactly when. She sat down in the chair he hadn't touched and looked at the folder she had found. Not because she'd been snooping, because the insurance forms really did need to be filed, and because she had learned from a decade of managing a non-profit's books what overstated income looked like, and what she had seen in that folder had made her hands go very still. She opened it again now, slowly. The vendor payments didn't match anything in Crestfield's public filings. The disbursements were categorized as operational expenses, but the receiving entity, a shell company called Duvain Advisory LLC, didn't appear anywhere in the vendor registry she had quietly pulled from a professional contact 2 weeks ago when she first started feeling like something was wrong. She hadn't been able to name the feeling then. She could name it now. Someone inside Crestfield Capital was pulling money out through a company that didn't exist in any meaningful way, and the authorization signatures on 2 of the transfers were hers, her name, her signature, on documents she had never seen before that night. Lena had met Preston at a fundraising gala 11 years ago when she was 26 and had just taken over her father's struggling community foundation after his stroke. Preston had been charming and certain in the way of men who had never been told they couldn't have something. He'd donated generously that night, offered to introduce her to 3 board members who could help stabilize the foundation's funding, and called her the next morning before she'd even had coffee. She had been flattered. She had also been 26 and exhausted and holding something her father had spent 30 years building, and Preston had seemed like solid ground. Her mother had said, at the rehearsal dinner, that Lena had found a good man. Her father, still recovering and seated in a wheelchair at the end of the table, had watched Preston give his toast and said nothing at all. She had thought, at the time, that her father was just tired. By the time the foundation had stabilized, and it had stabilized because Lena had worked 70-hour weeks and restructured the entire grant portfolio from scratch. Preston was already COO of Crestfield Capital, and they had moved into the house in Ashford Hills, and everything from the outside looked exactly like success was supposed to look. What the outside didn't show was that Preston had stopped asking her about the foundation around year 4, stopped coming to the annual gala around year 6, started working late in a pattern that had a different shape than work usually had. Not the random, urgent lateness of someone managing a crisis, but the consistent, managed lateness of someone managing a schedule. She had noticed. She had asked. He had told her she was imagining things, and she had believed him longer than she should have, because believing him was easier than the alternative. The alternative arrived in her inbox on a Tuesday in February in the form of an email from someone named Celeste Dunmore. The email was short. It contained 2 photographs. It contained a statement of fact, delivered without apology or dramatics. "I've been seeing your husband for 2 years. I thought you should know. I'm not asking you to do anything. I just thought you should know." Lena had read the email 4 times. Then she had closed her laptop and driven to the foundation's office and sat at her desk and done exactly what she always did when something threatened to swallow her whole. She worked. She reviewed grant applications. She answered donor correspondence. She signed 3 thank you letters by hand. She did not cry until she was in the parking garage at 9 o'clock at night with nobody watching. She did not tell Preston she had seen the email. She had started watching instead. The vendor payments were the 4th thing she found. The first was the travel calendar discrepancy, trips to Denver and Atlanta that appeared on his personal credit card but not on Crestfield's expense reports, billed instead to a corporate account she had no name for. The second was a forwarded document from a Crestfield attorney that arrived at their shared home email address by mistake, referencing a legal matter she had never heard of. The third was a conversation she accidentally overheard through a half-open door at the Crestfield holiday party. Preston and a man she didn't recognize, low-voiced, the words Duvain, and before quarter-end landing clearly through the noise of the room. She had photographed the visible page of the desk calendar behind him before Preston saw her reflection in the glass partition and came to take her arm and steer her toward the canapes. "You look tired," he'd said. "I'm fine," she'd said. She had learned over the years how to look fine. Now she sat at the kitchen table with the folder in front of her and her phone in her hand, and she called the one person she trusted completely. Her older brother Raymond answered on the second ring even though it was past 11. "What happened?" he said. Not a question. Raymond had always been able to read her voice. "I found something," she said. "In Preston's office. I need you to tell me if I'm wrong about what I'm looking at." She photographed each page of the folder and sent them to him while they stayed on the line. She listened to the silence on his end while he looked at them. Raymond was a forensic accountant. He had spent 20 years finding exactly the kind of things she was looking at now. The silence lasted almost 4 minutes. "Lena," he finally said, "these are your signatures." "I know. Did you sign these?" "No." Another silence. "Okay," Raymond said. "Don't touch the folder. Don't put it back. Put it somewhere he won't think to look, and then don't say a word to him." "Not one word, Raymond. Not one word," he said again. "I'll be there in the morning." Raymond came with coffee and a colleague named Adrian Cole, a financial crimes attorney who had the kind of quiet, still energy that Lena associated with people who had heard a great many terrible things and were no longer surprised by any of them. They sat at the same kitchen table while the morning came through the windows grey and slow. Adrian Cole asked her questions for 2 hours, where she had found the documents, whether she had any record of the home email forward, whether she could document the timeline of the travel discrepancies, whether she had ever, at any point, signed a document for Crestfield Capital on Preston's behalf. She hadn't. She wasn't an employee. She had never been on payroll. She had no role at Crestfield. "Then someone created that signature," Adrian said. "Can they do that?" she asked, and then she heard how the question sounded and corrected herself. "How hard is it?" "Not hard enough," he said, "especially if someone had access to documents bearing your signature from other contexts, a check, a letter, a gift card." She thought of the foundation. All the letters she'd signed, the donation acknowledgements, the grant agreements, all bearing her name in her handwriting, all shared with donors who had then shared them, who knew where. "How much," Raymond said, looking at Adrian, "is actually missing?" Adrian took a breath. "Based on what I can see here, and assuming these are only the documents that made it home with him accidentally, we're looking at a pattern that suggests somewhere between $4 and $8 million moved through Duvain Advisory over an 18-month period. But I would need full access to Crestfield's internal records to put a real number on it." The kitchen was very quiet. "He's going to say I did it," Lena said. She said it flatly, without drama, because she had been doing the math on this since 11 the night before, and she had arrived at that conclusion hours ago. "He already has my signature on the transfers. If this investigation opens, I'm the one it opens on." Neither Raymond nor Adrian said she was wrong. She was right. 11 days later, 2 federal investigators came to the Foundation's office and asked to speak with her privately. They were polite. They were thorough. They informed her that her name appeared on documentation related to an active financial crimes investigation involving Crestfield Capital Group, and that she was being asked to surrender her passport, pending the completion of their inquiry. She handed over her passport. She did not look at the staff members watching from the open office behind the investigator's shoulder. She walked them out herself and held the door and said calmly that she would cooperate with everything they needed. She called Adrian from the parking lot. "It's moving faster than I expected," he said. "But we knew this was coming. Are you all right? I need you to file the response we discussed," she said. "Already drafting it. And Adrian, I need you to pull the full Duvain Advisory corporate registration. I want to know who the registered agent is." There was a pause on his end. "We already pulled it, and the registered agent is a woman named Francesca Lee. She's listed as sole managing member. She has no prior business history." He paused again. "She also appears in Preston's phone records, which the investigator subpoenaed this morning." Lena leaned against the side of her car in the cold March air and looked at the bare trees at the edge of the parking lot. "How long?" she said quietly. "The company was registered 14 months ago," Adrian said. 14 months ago, Lena had organized a benefit dinner for the foundation that raised enough money to fund 3 years of after-school programming. Preston had come to that dinner. He had stood beside her at the podium and put his hand on her back while she spoke and smiled at the cameras. 14 months ago. "All right," she said. "What do I do next?" What she did next was go to work. Not because she wasn't scared, she was. She was acutely, quietly terrified in the way of someone who has understood that the ground beneath them is not solid and has decided to keep walking anyway because stopping isn't actually an option. She went to work at the foundation every morning, and she answered every question the investigators asked, and she gave Adrian every document he requested, and she did not speak to Preston beyond the minimum necessary exchanges in a house they still technically shared, because Adrian had advised her not to move out yet, and because she had been performing normalcy for long enough that it cost her almost nothing anymore. Preston, for his part, was performing too. He was attentive in the way he got when he needed something from her. He brought home dinner twice that week without being asked. He asked about the investigation in a voice calibrated to sound concerned rather than calculating. She watched him and said as little as possible and kept the folder, now copied 3 times, with each copy in a different location, somewhere he would never find it. What she didn't tell Preston, or the investigators, or even Raymond yet, was what she had found in the second drawer of her father's old desk the week before. Her father had died 14 months after his stroke. He had left the house in Ohio to her mother and a letter for Lena in a sealed envelope that their family attorney had held for 7 years at her father's explicit instruction to be delivered only when he judged the time was right. The attorney, a meticulous man named Howard Belk, who had managed the Hartwell family's affairs for 30 years, had called her the previous October and said simply that he believed the time had arrived. She hadn't opened the envelope immediately. She'd put it in the drawer and told herself she would read it when she had a quiet weekend, and then there were never quiet weekends. And then Preston had thrown the folder on the table, and her quiet weekend had never come. She opened the letter on a Thursday night while Preston was supposedly at a late dinner with clients. Her father's handwriting was careful and deliberate, the way it always had been. He had been a man who wrote everything by hand. He wrote that he was sorry he had never told her directly. He wrote that he had been afraid, not of her, but of what knowing would change for her, and whether she would have the life she wanted if she had grown up knowing what she was heir to. He wrote that her grandfather, James Hartwell, had not been only a factory foreman who saved carefully. He wrote that the Hartwell Family Trust, established in 1961 and restructured 3 times since, held a controlling interest in a private financial holding company called Meridian Bridge Partners. He wrote that Meridian Bridge Partners had assets under management of approximately $3.4 billion. He wrote that Lena, as his only surviving direct heir, was now the majority beneficiary of the Hartwell Family Trust, and that Howard Belk had the documentation to prove it. He wrote that he had watched Preston Hartwell at the rehearsal dinner and had said nothing because he had wanted to be wrong. He wrote, "I was not wrong, Lena. I'm sorry I wasn't wrong." She read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it back in the envelope and sat in the dark for a long time. Then she called Howard Belk. Howard Belk was 71 years old and had the unruffled patience of a man who had managed complicated things for a very long time. He confirmed everything in the letter. He walked her through the trust structure, the asset breakdown, the succession documentation her father had updated 6 months before his death. He explained that Meridian Bridge Partners was a private holding company with no public profile by design. Her grandfather had believed, and her father had agreed, that visible wealth invited the wrong kind of attention. The company operated through 3 subsidiary investment arms, held interests in 11 portfolio companies, and had never once appeared on any list or index that a casual search would surface. "Does anyone know?" she asked. "Outside of the people who have to know?" "Very few," Howard said. "Your father was careful, as was your grandfather before him. Does Preston know?" A brief pause. "That is not something I can answer with certainty. What I can tell you is that your father never disclosed it to him directly. Whether Mr. Hartwell discovered it through other means is a question I cannot speak to." She thought about the Duvain advisory transfers, the forged signatures, the timing, 14 months, the same window as the shell company registration. She thought about whether Preston had married her because he loved her or because he had found a document somewhere that told him who her grandfather had been and had spent 11 years waiting for the right moment. She thought about the fact that if she had never found the insurance folder, she might have spent the rest of her life not knowing either thing. "Howard," she said, "I need to understand exactly what authority I have in my current capacity as majority beneficiary," he told her. She listened for a very long time. The federal investigation moved in the direction of Lena for exactly 19 more days. On day 20, Adrian Cole filed a comprehensive evidentiary response that included a forensic analysis of the Duvain advisory transfers, paid for, though the investigators didn't know it yet, by a trust account that had more money in it than Preston Hartwell had made in his entire career. The analysis, conducted by a team of 3 forensic accountants Raymond had coordinated, demonstrated with specificity that the signature on the fraudulent transfers was a composite, elements of Lena's handwriting from 4 different documented sources, assembled digitally and reproduced. The technology to identify this had existed for several years. Nobody had looked for it because nobody had paid for anyone to look. The analysis also traced the outflow from Duvain Advisory to a personal account held jointly by Preston Hartwell and Francesca Lee at a bank in the Cayman Islands. On day 23, the investigators came back to the Foundation's office. This time they were looking for Preston. Preston was arrested on a Wednesday morning outside the Crestfield Capital offices. Lena was not there. She was at the Foundation, reviewing a grant application for a literacy program serving 300 elementary school students on the side of the city. Her phone lit up with Raymond's name. "It's done," he said. She set the phone down on her desk and looked at the grant application for a moment. Then she picked it up again and kept reading, because 300 children were waiting on this decision, and her answer was yes, and there was paperwork that needed to move. Francesca Lee was charged alongside Preston. The Cayman account was frozen. Crestfield Capital's board, suddenly aware that their COO had been routing money through a shell company for 18 months, convened an emergency session and placed 3 senior executives on administrative leave, pending a full internal audit. Preston called Lena from custody. She did not answer. She sent the call to Adrian. The investigation into her was formally closed 9 days after Preston's arrest. She stood in Howard Belk's office the following week and signed the documentation that formally activated her standing as majority beneficiary of the Hartwell Family Trust. Howard had arranged for a notary, a witness, and a cup of very good coffee. "Your grandfather would have been pleased," Howard said as she signed the last page. "He never met me," Lena said. "No," Howard agreed, "but your father told him about you. He said you were the one who would know what to do with it." She capped the pen and looked out the window at the city below. She thought about the vendor payments that didn't match, the travel receipts, the email from Celeste Dunmore that had arrived on a Tuesday in February and cracked something open that she had needed cracked open for years. She thought about her father's letter sitting in the dark drawer for months while she was too busy to read it, and how strange it was that things timed themselves the way they did, that everything had surfaced at once, the betrayal and the inheritance, like the universe had decided she could only handle them together. She thought about what Raymond had said to her the morning after she called him, when she had been sitting at the kitchen table with cold coffee, and the folder and the sick, hollow feeling of someone whose life has just changed shape without permission. He had said, "You've been running that foundation on nothing but will and a shoestring budget for 11 years. Imagine what you could do with real resources." She hadn't let herself to imagine it then. She was allowing herself to imagine it now. The Community Trust had 63 active programs serving roughly 12,000 residents across 4 neighborhoods. A dental clinic that operated out of a converted storefront, a job training center that placed 600 people in employment last year, an after-school program that was, as of the most recent evaluation, producing measurable outcomes in reading proficiency that exceeded the district average. All of it running on grants and donations, and her absolute refusal to let any of it fail. She was still the director of that foundation. That hadn't changed and wasn't going to change. What had changed was what she could bring to it. The divorce proceedings opened in April. Preston, advised by counsel, attempted to claim a portion of assets associated with the Hartwell Family Trust on the grounds of marital entanglement. The claim was dismissed at the preliminary hearing. The Hartwell Family Trust had been established before their marriage, was not commingled with marital assets at any point, and Lena's standing as beneficiary had been documented and sealed by her father's attorney years before Preston Hartwell had any knowledge of its existence. The family court judge, a composed woman in her 60s named Judge Teresa Wainwright, noted in her ruling that the attempt to claim trust assets in light of the criminal fraud charges against the petitioning party was, and she chose her words carefully here, particularly difficult to understand from a strategic perspective. Preston's attorney moved on. Lena's attorney did not need to. She was awarded the house in Ashford Hills, though she had already decided she didn't want it. She would sell it in the summer, and the proceeds would go into the foundation's capital reserve. She had already identified a building downtown, a former bank branch as it happened, with good bones and high ceilings and the right kind of space for a community organization that was about to get considerably larger. Raymond helped her pick out the building. He stood in the center of the empty main floor with afternoon light coming through the tall windows and looked around and said, "Dad would have liked this. He would have wanted to see the structural report first," Lena said. Raymond laughed. It was the first time she had heard him really laugh in months, They ate lunch at a diner across the street after the walkthrough, and Raymond ordered the same thing he always ordered: black coffee and a turkey club. No tomato. And they sat in a booth by the window and didn't talk about Preston or Francesca, or the investigation, or the criminal charges, or any of the things that had occupied the last 4 months. They talked about the dental clinic and whether they could expand its hours. They talked about the job training program and a new partnership with a community college that was still being negotiated. They talked about their mother, who was 72 and had decided to take a painting class at the senior center and apparently had real talent and was considering entering a local exhibition, which Raymond found both surprising and entirely on brand. Lena drove home that afternoon through the city she had lived in for 11 years and thought about the letter in the drawer and the folder on the table and the email on the Tuesday in February, and about how none of it was the story she had expected to be living at 37. But she had also not expected to have built something that 12,000 people relied on, or to have done it without a safety net for 11 years, or to have stood in a parking garage in the cold and cried alone, and then gone back inside and finished the work anyway. She had not expected any of that either. The Hartwell Community Trust broke ground on the new facility on a warm morning in September. 300 people attended, the dental clinic staff came, the job training graduates came, a dozen board members, and twice as many volunteers came. Raymond came, and their mother came, and Howard Belk came, and stood near the back in a good suit, and watched everything with a quiet expression that she recognized, because her father had worn it too, the expression of someone witnessing something they had been waiting a long time to see. Lena Hartwell stood at the podium that morning with the city behind her and the sun on the building's facade, and said what she meant, which was what she always did, because she had never been very good at saying anything else. She said that the work was the thing, that the work had always been the thing, that every program and every clinic and every person who had walked through any of their doors had been built by people who showed up, and that what they were building here was just more room for more people to show up. She did not mention Preston. She did not mention the investigation, or the arrest, or the trust, or what her grandfather had left her, or what her father had known. She didn't need to. 12,000 people already had everything they needed.